Let's go straight now to Natasha Hausdorff. She's a barrister and a member of UK Lawyers for Israel and has been a regular guest on this show throughout the horrific period of since the October 7th massacre, and joins us now. A very good morning to you, Natasha.
Good morning, Julia.
I have to say, I'm sure you, like me, had shed a few tears on Sunday as we saw the release of those three hostages, including a British hostage from Hamas's clutches. Extraordinary scenes in Gaza and extraordinary scenes watching them greeted by their mothers. We still want another 30 to come home in this first phase of this ceasefire deal. And indeed, it's thought some 60 of the 94 remaining are still alive, wanting both the alive and the dead to be returned to their families. Ceasefire has begun, has kept going in Gaza. What are your thoughts? What are your hopes and fears about this ceasefire deal? Whether it will continue, whether there will be a lasting peace, and whether you'll get all the hostages home?
Well, as President Trump referred to it yesterday, it is a temporary ceasefire. It's due to progress in stages, and certainly the rate at which hostages are set to be released. Hamas has just announced 4 women it intends to release on Saturday. It hasn't provided the names yet, but this very slow, staggered release does indeed suggest that Hamas is continuing to play for time.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right that the emotion, I think, around the world at the release of these 3 young women, stories that their stories have been followed by many. And I think certainly in Israel, there's a strong sense of all of these hostages being very much part of everyone's family, adoptive family. So the emotion is significant, but Israel is, of course, also extremely divided about this, what some have called a deal, some others have called extortion. And the families of victims of terror attacks who have seen the perpetrators of these attacks be released in exchange have likewise been extremely emotional about developments.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's a very, very high ransom to pay to get these people back. I mean, those first 3 women released in return for 90 prisoners. I mean, some detainees, but we know that some of the prisoners to release, about 1,000 overall from Israeli jails, are convicted, terrorists, rapists, murderers, very, very, very dangerous men. And we know Yahya Sinwar, the man who orchestrated the Hamas attack on October the 7th, was himself previously a prisoner, released in a similar such deal. It's a very, very high price to be paid. I wonder if it wasn't a member of my family, if that would be a price I would be willing to pay. There have been lots of jubilation at the release of prisoners, but also at the bomb stopping falling in Gaza. Of course, they never needed to be falling if, of course, Hamas hadn't attacked on October the 7th in the first place. What hopes do you have, though, that this will hold, given, it turns out, guess what? Terrorists can't be trusted. I know it's a surprise to everyone, but it's also given the pressures on the Netanyahu government as well. And how much does Trump's arrival in the White House change things?
Well, certainly, I think everything changed yesterday, and we saw in the first day of his presidency, Trump and his team showed more understanding of the situation in the Middle East than the last 4 years of the Biden administration demonstrated. I think it's important to note that this much was perhaps acknowledged by the former Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, when only a couple of weeks ago he admitted that America's policy, especially over the last 15 months towards the crisis in the Middle East, has emboldened Hamas. That the so-called daylight that he described between Israel and America, in fact, probably scuppered previous hostage deals. And what we've seen is a complete reversal, even in the first day of the Trump presidency, with a series of executive orders that were signed yesterday. But I think very importantly, a recognition that there is going to be a new approach to the Middle East, one which will undoubtedly serve the Palestinians far better than the Biden administration, not just the Israelis. When we consider that the emboldening of Hamas has wreaked this devastation that you've described in Gaza, which was, I agree, entirely unnecessary, emboldened Hamas, worsened the situation for the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, as many people have been saying, there is a new sheriff in town. The policy I think we can all understand is going to go back to that which ultimately gave us the Abraham Accords, and that is something to be celebrated.
But again, we've seen, the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, absolutely clear. Just, Defense Secretary, destruction of Hamas. End of. They want every last Hamas fighter dead. There isn't a moderate version of Palestinian leadership. There is less extreme than Hamas, but by no means moderate leadership. We also know that most of the Palestinian groups in the Middle East don't actually want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. That one state does not involve Israel or indeed Jewish people existing at all. So how is this going to come out? How are we going to establish any peace in the Middle East? Whether this ceasefire deal holds in Gaza or not, whether the reconstruction money goes in, whether or not Hamas is able to rebuild or not, how do we actually get to proper, long-lasting peace?
Well, you're absolutely right that the Palestinian leadership across the board is perfectly clear about its genocidal aims. You mentioned Yahya Sinwar, the orchestrator of the 7th of October attacks. Also Ali Kadi, the head of the Nukhba force, who worked very closely in planning over a course of 2 years, was also released in the Gilad Shalit deal. Their salaries as released prisoners continued to be paid by the Palestinian Authority.
That tells you everything.
As the moderates in this equation.
And they're the moderates. But that's the thing. Like, we've only got about sort of 20 seconds left. Do you see, like, in 5 years' time that we have peace in the Middle East? This is all over?
Ultimately, I think it depends on America leading a change in attitude and perspective in the West, around the world, a recognition of the real issues here, which are these genocidal aims, indoctrination, and the pay-for-slay salary system that incentivizes terror. Without that changing, I'm afraid we're going to continue along the same vein. But I am optimistic that this change in leadership can have significant consequences for a change in attitude across the West.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Natasha Halsdorf from Tom Slater. A lot of this is about backing Israel and not giving succor to Hamas and not funding Hamas as effectively the West has been doing for the last 20 years.
No, absolutely. You can only hope that change is one that we're going to witness. Donald Trump was rhetorically very behind Israel, but with this hostage deal as an example, does sometimes politics and the desire to get something over the line.
Indeed.